Money can buy silence, power, and a private jet to Aspen, but it can never buy absolution. Sylvia Sterling, worth over $4 billion, thought she was just buying a quiet Tuesday dinner for her son. Instead, she was walking straight into a collision course with a ghost she had buried alive. The mahogany doors of the Sterling Ascendant boardroom closed with a soft, expensive thud, sealing away the murmurs of 60-year-old men who had just been outmaneuvered by a woman half their age. Sylvia Sterling, 34, sole heir and CEO of the global logistics empire, didn't look back. She adjusted the cuffs of her charcoal Tom Ford blazer, her face an unreadable mask of cool composure. The merger with Harrison Freed is finalized. Miss Sterling, her assistant, Chloe, whispered, matching Sylvia's brisk pace down the glass-walled corridor. Shares are already up 4% in after-hours trading. Also, the gala at the Met. Cancel the gala, Sylvia interrupted, her voice perfectly modulated, yet sharp enough to cut glass. Chloe blinked, her tablet momentarily forgotten. Cancel, ma'am? The mayor is expecting you. The press release. Send a donation. $1 million to whatever pediatric ward they're parading around tonight. Make sure they know it's in honor of the mayor's mother. I don't care. Just get me out of it. Sylvia stopped at the private elevator, pressing her thumb against the biometric scanner. Tonight, I am off the clock. Where is Leo? He was picked up from Dalton half an hour ago. He's with his nanny, Margaret, at the penthouse. Tell Haskins to bring the car around. We are going to dinner, just me and my son. 10 minutes later, Sylvia was sinking into the pristine white leather seats of her armored Maybach. The glass partition separated her from her driver, Haskins, an ex-Secret Service agent who knew better than to ask questions. As the car glided through the rain-slicked streets of Manhattan, Sylvia allowed the mask of the ruthless CEO to slip, just a fraction. She rubbed her temples, exhaustion pooling behind her eyes. 2 years ago, her husband, Michael, had died in a private helicopter crash over the Hamptons. Since then, Sylvia had taken the reins of his crumbling empire, ruthlessly cutting away the rot, firing his incompetent cronies, and turning a bankrupt shell into a $4 billion juggernaut. Wall Street called her a visionary. Forbes called her a titan. But her 8-year-old son, Leo, just called her late. When the Maybach pulled into the private underground garage of her Tribeca penthouse, Sylvia took a deep breath. She had everything in the world, yet the silence in her home was deafening. She rode the private elevator up, stepping into a massive, minimalist living space overlooking the Hudson River. Mom. Leo came bounding around the corner, nearly tripping over the corner of an antique Persian rug. He was wearing his school uniform, a navy blazer and khakis, but his tie was haphazardly draped around his neck. Sylvia caught him, burying her face in his hair, breathing in the scent of cedarwood soap and little boy. "Hey, my love, why are you still in your uniform? Margaret said you had the big fancy dinner tonight, so I didn't need to change yet. I was going to eat with her." His voice dropped, a subtle note of resignation coloring his words. It was a tone a child shouldn't possess. Guilt, sharp and familiar, twisted in Sylvia's gut. "Well, Margaret was wrong. I canceled the big fancy dinner. Go grab a jacket. We're going out." Leo's eyes widened, lighting up the vast, empty room. "Really? Can we go to Le Bernardin?" Sylvia laughed softly. "You don't even like seafood, Leo. You just like the bread. The bread is really good," he countered defensively. No Michelin stars tonight, Sylvia decided, a sudden craving for normalcy washing over her. She was tired of foam, truffles, and people who only spoke to her because of her net worth. Where would a normal kid want to eat on a rainy Tuesday? Leo thought for a moment, his brow furrowed exactly the way Michael's used to. There's that diner. The one near the park with the neon clock. Tommy from school says they have pancakes for dinner. Billionaire. Haskins would have a fit securing a public diner, but looking at the hope in her son's eyes, Sylvia nodded. A diner it is. O'Malley's family restaurant was exactly the kind of establishment Sylvia Sterling avoided at all costs. It was brightly lit by flickering fluorescent tubes, smelled overwhelmingly of stale coffee and fryer grease, and the linoleum floor stuck slightly to the soles of her Christian Louboutin heels. Haskins had swept the place 3 minutes before they walked in, securing a corner booth with a clear sightline of both exits. He now sat 2 tables away, nursing a black coffee and scanning the room with predatory calm. Sylvia slid into the cracked red vinyl booth opposite Leo. Despite the griminess of the place, Leo was buzzing with excitement, eagerly scanning the laminated, sticky menu. "They have a sundae called the Volcano," Leo whispered in awe. "It comes with an actual sparkler. You can have it after you eat some real food." Sylvia smiled, reaching across the table to straighten his collar. For a fleeting moment, she felt like a normal mother. No board meetings, no SEC filings, just a Tuesday night with her son. It was then that the bell above the diner door jingled. Sylvia didn't look up immediately, but her peripheral vision caught the subtle tightening of Haskins' jaw. He hadn't drawn a weapon, but his posture had shifted from passive observation to active assessment. Naturally, Sylvia followed his gaze. Walking into the diner was a man and a little girl. The man looked to be in his late 30s, but he carried the heavy, slumped posture of someone a decade older. He was wearing a faded olive-green canvas jacket, the kind sold at military surplus stores, frayed at the cuffs. His dark hair was overgrown, curling damply against his collar from the rain, and his face was etched with a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. Clinging tightly to his hand was a little girl, perhaps 7 years old. She was wearing a brightly colored, mismatched outfit, a pink tutu over striped leggings, and a worn-out denim jacket. She clutched a small, plastic unicorn. The hostess, a teenager chewing gum with aggressive apathy, led them to the booth directly across the aisle from Sylvia and Leo. Sylvia tried to focus back on Leo, who was debating between a cheeseburger and a stack of chocolate chip pancakes, but her attention kept drifting to the pair across the aisle. She couldn't help it. The contrast was too stark. The man helped the little girl slide into the booth, handing her a menu. "All right, sweetie, anything you want. It's your birthday dinner." The little girl's face lit up. "Can I have a milkshake? A strawberry one?" "A milkshake and a main course," the man said, offering a tight, strained smile. "Whatever you want." Sylvia watched as the waitress approached their table. The man ordered a strawberry milkshake and a grilled cheese sandwich with fries for the girl. "And for you, hun?" the waitress asked, pen poised over her pad. "Just water," the man said softly. "Ice water is fine." "You gotta order food if you're taking up a booth during dinner rush," the waitress snapped, popping her gum. "Manager's policy." The man flinched slightly. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a worn leather wallet. He opened it, shielding the contents from his daughter. But from Sylvia's angle, she could see inside. There were a few crumpled single-dollar bills. No credit cards, no thick wad of cash. Just add a side of toast. Then, the man said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Please." The waitress rolled her eyes, scribbled it down, and walked away. Sylvia felt a sudden, sharp ache in her chest. She had authorized acquisitions worth billions today. She had spent more on her shoes than this man probably made in a month. But that wasn't what held her gaze. It was the man's hands. As he placed his wallet back on the table, the fluorescent light caught a very specific, jagged scar running across the back of his left hand, disappearing under his watch strap. And beside his hand, his wallet rested open for a fraction of a second, revealing a faded ID card tucked into the clear plastic sleeve. Vanguard Engineering. Sylvia's breath hitched in her throat. The diner sounds, the clattering plates, the sizzle of the grill. Leo's chatter suddenly faded into a distant, muffled roar. She stared at the man's face. Beneath the overgrown beard, the sunken eyes, and the shadow of poverty, the bone structure was unmistakable. It was Henry Pendleton. 5 years ago, Vanguard Engineering, a subsidiary of her late husband's holding company, had been responsible for the catastrophic collapse of the Skyline Bridge in Seattle. 3 people had died. The ensuing investigation revealed massive corner cutting, cheap materials, and falsified safety reports. Her husband, Michael, had needed a scapegoat to save the empire. He found one in his lead structural engineer. Henry Pendleton had been the whistleblower, the one who tried to stop the project, but Michael's lawyers had systematically destroyed him. They forged documents bearing Henry's signature, buried him in litigation, and painted him to the press as a negligent, greedy contractor. Henry was indicted, lost his license, his reputation, and, ultimately, his wife to the stress of it all. He served 3 years in federal prison. Sylvia had known. She had found the real documents in Michael's private safe a week after Michael's death. But revealing them would have meant tearing down her own company, surrendering her wealth to a mountain of class action lawsuits, and ruining the legacy she was building for Leo. So, she had burned the papers. She had chosen silence. She had chosen power. And now, the man whose life she had tacitly agreed to destroy was sitting 3 feet away, ordering a side of toast because he couldn't afford a meal on his daughter's birthday. "Mom?" Leo's voice broke through the roaring in her ears. "Are you okay? You look like you saw a ghost." Sylvia forced a swallow, her throat bone dry. "I'm fine, sweetheart." She watched Henry Pendleton smile at his daughter as the waitress practically threw a plate of grilled cheese and a strawberry milkshake onto their table. The little girl eagerly grabbed a fry, completely oblivious to the fact that her father was staring out the window, quietly breaking apart a single piece of dry toast. Every instinct of self-preservation screamed at Sylvia to look away, to pay the bill, take Leo, and walk out. To have Haskins whisk them back to the penthouse, where the world was controlled and safe. But Sylvia Sterling hadn't built an empire by running away from ghosts. She stood up. Haskins immediately shifted, half rising from his chair, but Sylvia subtly held up a hand, stopping him in his tracks. "Leo, start on your food. I'll be right back," Sylvia said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline pounding in her veins. She crossed the narrow aisle. The scent of cheap fryer oil gave way to the faint smell of rain and damp canvas as she stopped at the edge of their booth. Henry didn't look up immediately. He was busy wiping a smudge of strawberry milkshake from his daughter's chin with a thin paper napkin. "Excuse me," Sylvia said softly. Henry finally looked up. His eyes, a hollow, stormy gray, met hers. For a second, there was only confusion. A billionaire CEO in a designer suit was completely out of context in a place like O'Malley's. But then, as his eyes swept over her face, recognition dawned. It wasn't a sudden gasp. It was a slow, agonizing realization. The blood drained from Henry's face, leaving him paler than the harsh diner lighting. His jaw tightened, the muscles ticking rapidly, and his hands, resting on the table, curled into tight, white-knuckled fists. "Lily," Henry said, his voice deceptively calm, though it vibrated with a tight, restrained frequency. "Take your milkshake and go stand by the jukebox. Don't put any money in. Just look at the lights. But Daddy, my grilled cheese." "Now, Lily," he said, the edge in his voice leaving no room for argument. The little girl grabbed her tall glass and scurried over to the glowing Wurlitzer in the corner. Henry slowly turned back to Sylvia. The exhaustion was gone, replaced by a cold, searing hatred that seemed to lower the temperature of the air between them. "If your lawyers sent you," Henry said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp, "tell them they're too late. I have nothing left for you to take." Michael made sure of that. "Michael is dead," Sylvia said, keeping her voice incredibly low. "I know," Henry replied coldly. "I read the obituary. I didn't send flowers. Why are you here, Mrs. Sterling?" Sylvia looked down at the half-eaten dry toast on his plate, then back up to the man whose career had been the sacrificial lamb for her current empire. She could walk away right now. She could claim it was a mistake. Instead, she did the unbelievable. Sylvia slid into the booth opposite him, right where his daughter had been sitting. She placed her hands flat on the sticky table, right over his worn wallet, and looked him dead in the eye. "I am here, Henry," Sylvia said, her voice shaking for the first time in years, "to give you back your life." The silence that followed Sylvia's declaration was heavier than the humid, grease-laden air of O'Malley's family restaurant. Henry stared at her, his jaw locked, his gray eyes searching her perfectly manicured face for the punchline. When he found none, a harsh, humorless sound scraped the back of his throat. "Give me back my life?" Henry repeated, the words dripping with a corrosive mixture of grief and pure disdain. He leaned forward, ignoring the boundaries of personal space, his voice a low hiss. "My wife, Claire, took an overdose of sleeping pills because the press camped on our lawn for 6 months, calling me a murderer. My engineering license was revoked by the state board. I spent 36 months in Allenwood Federal Penitentiary. So, tell me, Mrs. Sterling, did you bring a time machine in that armored Maybach parked out front?" Sylvia didn't flinch. She had faced down hostile takeovers and ruthless hedge fund managers at Cravath, Swain, and Moore, but none of them possessed the raw, unfiltered, righteous anger of the man sitting across from her. "I can't undo the past, Henry," Sylvia said, keeping her voice leveled, though her hands trembled slightly beneath the table. "I can't bring Claire back, but I can give you your name. I can give you your license. And I can make sure the men who actually signed off on the substandard steel for the Skyline Bridge face the Department of Justice." Henry's eyes narrowed. "Michael was the one who signed off. And he's conveniently in the ground." "Michael authorized it," Sylvia corrected, her tone turning entirely business. "But he didn't act alone. Preston Carlisle, the current COO of Sterling Ascendant, brokered the deal with the concrete suppliers. The board knew. I didn't know the extent of it until after Michael's helicopter went down. I found his private ledgers in a safe in our Hamptons estate." Henry let out a breath that was half scoff, half sigh. "And what did you do with those ledgers, Sylvia?" "Let me guess. You handed them over to the FBI? You held a press conference?" He looked at her designer suit, the subtle glint of her Cartier watch. "No, you buried them. You kept the billions. You let me rot on parole." "I burned them," Sylvia admitted, the confession tasting like ash in her mouth. Henry's face went deadpan. He started to slide out of the booth. "We have nothing else to talk about. Don't ever approach my daughter or me again." "Wait," Sylvia commanded, a sharp edge of desperation cracking her polished exterior. "I burned them because releasing them would have triggered a total liquidation of Sterling Ascendant. The class action lawsuits would have drained the company dry. Thousands of innocent employees would have lost their pensions. And my son," she glanced across the aisle to where Leo was happily drowning his pancakes in syrup, oblivious to the warfare happening 10 feet away, would have inherited nothing but his father's disgrace. Henry paused, half standing, glancing at the boy, then over to the jukebox, where his own daughter, Lily, was tracing the neon lights with a small finger. The universal vulnerability of a parent anchored him just enough to listen. "So, why now?" Henry asked, sitting back down slowly. "Why risk it all tonight? Just a sudden attack of conscience over dry toast?" "Because it's happening again," Sylvia said, leaning in, her voice dropping to a frantic whisper. "Sterling Ascendant just won the city bid for the Hudson River commuter tunnel. It's a $10 billion infrastructure project. Yesterday, I was reviewing the preliminary supply chain audits. The concrete vendor is a shell company registered in Delaware. I traced the parent LLC. It's the exact same supplier Michael used for the Skyline Bridge. Preston Carlisle pushed the contract through while I was dealing with the Harrison Freight merger. Henry's engineering instincts, dormant but never dead, flared to life. The bedrock under the Hudson requires a high-density, marine-grade concrete mix. If they use the same cut-rate aggregate they used in Seattle, the water pressure will cause micro-fissures within 3 years. It won't just collapse, it will drown thousands of commuters. I know, Sylvia said, but I can't prove it. If I bring in an outside auditing firm, Preston will get wind of it, destroy the paper trail, and force me out through a vote of no confidence. He has the board in his pocket. I am the CEO, but I am surrounded by my husband's wolves. Sylvia reached into her pristine Birkin bag and pulled out a sleek, black secondary smartphone, sliding it across the sticky table until it touched Henry's scarred hand. I need an engineer, Sylvia said, her eyes locked on his. Someone brilliant, someone who knows exactly how Preston and Michael hid their tracks, because he was framed by them. I need you to audit the Hudson Tunnel blueprints and supply manifests from the inside. From the inside? Henry laughed, a dry, incredulous sound. I'm a convicted felon. I can't even get a job sweeping floors at an architectural firm. You won't be Henry Pendleton, Sylvia replied instantly. I have already set up an independent consulting LLC under the name Thomas Wright. You will be my personal, direct report auditor. You bypass HR, you bypass the board, you report only to me. And when we find the proof, Henry challenged, I hand Preston Carlisle and the board to the SEC and the feds on a silver platter, Sylvia said, her voice turning to ice. I testify that I recently uncovered Michael's old fraud alongside the new one. Sterling Ascendant will take a massive financial hit, but the core company will survive, and as part of the fallout, I will publicly release the internal communications proving you were framed. You get your license back. You get a settlement large enough to ensure Lily never has to look at a diner menu and worry about the prices again. Henry looked down at the black phone. It looked alien against the cracked vinyl table. It was a lifeline woven from barbed wire. If he took it, he was stepping back into the viper's nest that had destroyed his life. If he was caught, Preston would ensure he went back to federal prison for corporate espionage, violating his parole. Take the phone, Henry, Sylvia urged gently. Don't answer me now. Take 48 hours. Read the preliminary files I've loaded onto the encrypted drive on that device. Then decide if you want to help me tear them down. Without waiting for his answer, Sylvia stood up. She pulled a crisp $100 bill from her purse, slipping it discreetly under the edge of his water glass. Happy birthday, Lily. Sylvia called out softly toward the jukebox. She walked back to her own booth, gathered a very confused Leo, and gave Haskins a subtle nod. Within 30 seconds, the billionaire and her entourage vanished into the rainy Manhattan night, leaving Henry staring at a black phone that felt heavier than a block of lead. 48 hours later, the rain had cleared, leaving the glass and steel canyons of Park Avenue gleaming under a harsh, unforgiving sun. Sylvia stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of her corner office on the 60th floor of the Sterling Ascendant building. She was dressed for war, a crimson Alexander McQueen sheath dress and a posture carved from marble. Miss Sterling, Chloe's voice crackled softly over the intercom. Your 3 o'clock appointment is here. A Mr. Thomas Wright. Sylvia closed her eyes, letting out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. He came. Send him in, Chloe, and hold all my calls, especially from Preston. The heavy oak doors opened. Henry walked in. He looked completely different, yet exactly the same. He was wearing a dark navy suit, undoubtedly bought off the rack from a mid-tier department store the day prior, but it fit his broad shoulders well enough. He had trimmed his beard down to a neat shadow, and his hair was pulled back, emphasizing the sharp, intelligent lines of his face. He didn't look like a defeated parolee anymore. He looked like a predator entering unfamiliar territory. Mr. Wright, Sylvia said, walking over to extend her hand. Henry took it. His grip was firm, his calluses a stark contrast to her soft skin. Mrs. Sterling. The files on that phone were enlightening. Enlightening enough to take the job? She asked, moving toward her sprawling mahogany desk. She tapped a keypad, and a massive digital schematic of the Hudson River commuter tunnel illuminated the screen embedded in the wall. Enlightening enough to realize Preston Carlyle is an arrogant fool, Henry said, his eyes immediately locking onto the schematics. The transformation was instantaneous. The hesitant, broken man from the diner vanished, replaced by the brilliant lead engineer who had once been the youngest in Vanguard's history to oversee a billion-dollar project. Henry walked up to the screen, his finger tracing a complex matrix of support struts. He's using the exact same load-bearing algorithms Michael forced me to use in Seattle. He didn't even bother to change the structural modeling software. But the Hudson River has a completely different tidal shear force. Look here. He tapped a section of the tunnel's midpoint. If they use the aggregate concrete from the Delaware Shell Company, the tensile strength drops by 22%. Combine that with the tidal shear, and right here at section 4, you'll get a catastrophic microfracture cascade within 36 months of completion. Sylvia felt a cold sweat break out on the back of her neck. He had found it in 2 days. Her own internal safety compliance teams hadn't found it in 2 months. Can you prove it on paper? Sylvia asked. I can, Henry said, turning to face her. But I need access to the raw material manifests. The actual purchase orders, Preston, signed with the Delaware LLC. The files on your phone only show the budget projections. I need the hard receipts to prove intent to defraud. Those files are kept in the restricted physical servers on the 50th floor, Sylvia said, pacing the room. Only C-suite executives have biometric access. Even as CEO, if I badge in and download them, it flags it to the board immediately. They monitor me constantly. Before Henry could reply, the office door swung open without a knock. Sylvia, we need to talk about the... Preston Carlyle stopped dead in his tracks. He was a man in his late 50s, impeccably groomed, wearing a bespoke suit that cost more than Henry's entire net worth. He possessed the smooth, predatory charm of a man who had never faced a consequence in his life. Preston's eyes darted from the illuminated tunnel schematics on the wall to the stranger standing in the room. He didn't recognize Henry immediately. 5 years, 30 pounds of weight loss, and a beard provided a decent disguise, but his corporate paranoia was instantly triggered. Excuse me, Preston said, his tone dripping with patronizing authority. I wasn't aware we were taking pitches today. Who is this? Sylvia turned, her expression morphing into a mask of mild irritation. Preston, you know I hate it when you walk in unannounced. This is Thomas Wright. He is an independent risk assessment consultant I've brought on to review the Hudson Tunnel logistics. Preston's smile didn't reach his eyes. Risk assessment? Sylvia, darling, we have a team of 60 engineers in-house who handle risk assessment. We don't need outside contractors poking around our proprietary designs. It's a security liability. Our in-house team missed a crucial zoning variance on the Harrison Freight merger that nearly cost us $40 million. Sylvia fired back seamlessly, referring to a real mistake Preston's team had made last quarter. I am double-checking everything on the Hudson project. The mayor's office is breathing down my neck. Preston stepped further into the room, his gaze fixed on Henry. He looked Henry up and down, taking in the off-the-rack suit and the rugged demeanor that didn't quite fit the polished corporate world. Thomas Wright, Preston mused, stepping closer. Can't say I'm familiar with your firm. Where did you get your degree, Mr. Wright? Henry held Preston's gaze, his gray eyes cold and unblinking. He was standing 3 feet from the man who had helped forge the documents that sent him to prison. Sylvia held her breath, ready to intervene if Henry snapped. MIT, Henry said smoothly, his voice steady. But I've spent the last few years doing private consulting overseas. Dubai, mostly. Mrs. Sterling felt an outside perspective, unburdened by company politics, was necessary. Preston chuckled, a dry, dismissive sound. Well, Mr. Wright, try not to get lost in the blueprints. Structural engineering in New York is a bit more complicated than building sandcastles in the desert. He turned back to Sylvia. Board meeting at 4. Sylvia, don't be late. We're voting on the concrete supplier allocation. Preston turned and walked out, the heavy doors shutting firmly behind him. The silence in the office was suffocating. Sylvia let out a shaky exhale, looking at Henry. He hadn't moved a muscle, but his hands were balled into fists so tight his knuckles were white. "He's voting on the supplier allocation today," Henry stated, his voice devoid of emotion. "Once that vote passes, the contracts are locked. The money moves to the shell company. It will be 10 times harder to unravel. We need those manifests before 4 o'clock, Sylvia said, glancing at the antique clock on her desk. It was 3:15 p.m. We have 45 minutes to bypass a biometric lock and steal data from my own company. Henry finally relaxed his hands, walking over to the desk and picking up the black burner phone Sylvia had given him. He looked at her, a dangerous, reckless spark igniting in his eyes. "Mrs. Sterling," Henry said, the ghost of a real smile touching his lips for the first time. "I spent 3 years in federal prison with some of the most sophisticated white-collar criminals in the country. Let me show you what else I learned how to do." "What exactly did you learn in federal prison?" Sylvia asked, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper as she watched Henry dismantle the casing of his cheap burner phone with the tip of a titanium letter opener from her desk. "I bunked with a man named David Kenner," Henry said, his hands moving with the precise, practiced fluidity of a master engineer. He designed fire suppression logic boards for half the commercial high-rises in lower Manhattan, including this one. The 50th floor server room uses a localized inert gas system. If a thermal anomaly registers in the antechamber, the magnetic seal on the main server door automatically disengages for 90 seconds to allow any technicians to evacuate before the oxygen is purged. Henry pulled the lithium-ion battery from the phone, exposing the raw terminal wires. "If you log in with your CEO biometrics, IT is alerted. But if the fire safety protocol forces the door open, the system logs it as an environmental fault. No names, no biometric ping. We just need to create a very specific, localized heat spike directly under the antechamber's thermal sensor." Sylvia stared at him, a mixture of terror and profound respect pooling in her chest. It was 3:25 p.m. "We have 35 minutes. They moved fast. Sylvia led the way, utilizing her executive elevator override to bypass the standard security checkpoints, dropping them directly into the sterile, humming corridors of the 50th floor. The air here was chilled, smelling faintly of ozone and recycled nitrogen. When they reached the heavy steel door of the server antechamber, Sylvia swiped her general access card to get them into the preliminary hallway. Above the inner door, a small, blinking red LED indicated the thermal sensor. "Lift me up," Henry whispered. Sylvia, shedding her Alexander McQueen blazer, braced her hands against the wall, offering her knee as a step. Henry vaulted up, his heavy boots carefully avoiding her designer dress. He held the exposed lithium battery directly under the sensor and intentionally shorted the terminal wires with the metal letter opener. A sharp spark flared, followed by a concentrated burst of intense, localized heat as the battery critically overloaded. Henry dropped the smoking battery onto the linoleum and stamped it out just as a loud, mechanical clack echoed through the corridor. The heavy, magnetic lock on the server door disengaged. 90 seconds, Henry snapped, pushing the heavy door open. They rushed into the freezing, deafening roar of the server racks. Henry didn't hesitate. He knew exactly what a mainframe terminal looked like. He plugged the encrypted black phone Sylvia had given him into the primary diagnostic port. "Pathing to the restricted drives," Henry muttered, his fingers flying across the terminal keyboard. Preston hid them under a nested corporate subsidiary. Got it. Downloading the raw Delaware LLC manifests. The progress bar on the screen crawled. 20%, 45%, 60%. "Henry, the primary lights are flashing orange," Sylvia warned, watching the ceiling panels. "The gas purge sequence is initializing. We have 20 seconds. Baifinger Bashawu. Baifinger Joshawu. Come on," Henry hissed through his teeth. "Osuta percent. Transfer complete. He yanked the phone from the port, grabbed Sylvia's hand, and they sprinted out of the server room, the heavy steel door slamming shut and magnetically locking behind them, just as the hiss of inert gas began to fill the chamber. At 4:02 p.m., the mahogany doors of the primary boardroom on the 60th floor swung open. Preston Carlyle was standing at the head of the massive, polished granite table, a laser pointer in hand, illuminating a graph of projected Q3 margins for 12 silent, nodding board members. As you can see, locking in this supplier today secures our overhead, Preston was saying, his voice oozing with practiced confidence. All those in favor of authorizing the $10 billion allocation. The vote is cancelled, Sylvia said, her voice ringing out like a gunshot in the cavernous room. She walked in, her posture rigid, her eyes burning with a cold, absolute fury. Right beside her walked Henry Pendleton. Preston's smile vanished, replaced by a scowl of deep indignation. "Sylvia, what is the meaning of this?" "I told you, we are not entertaining your independent contractor right now. Security works for me, Preston," Sylvia countered smoothly, walking to the media console. She plugged the black phone into the projector feed. "And Mr. Wright is not here to pitch. He's here to present his findings." The screen behind Preston flashed, replacing his margin projections with a scanned document. It was a raw banking manifest. Murmurs erupted around the table as the board members adjusted their glasses. The document clearly showed the Delaware Shell Company's routing numbers directly linked to a private offshore trust in the Cayman Islands, a trust registered to Preston Carlyle. "What is this?" one of the senior board members demanded, slamming his hand on the table. "Preston, are you skimming the Hudson budget?" "It's a fabrication," Preston sputtered, his face flushing a violent, mottled purple. He pointed a trembling finger at Henry. "She hired this nobody to forge documents because she's threatened by my leadership. Look at him. He's a thug in a cheap suit who doesn't even know the first thing about engineering." Henry stepped forward. The room went dead silent. "Actually, Preston, I know quite a bit about engineering," Henry said, his voice a low, commanding rumble that commanded the absolute attention of every billionaire in the room. "I know that the tidal shear force of the Hudson River will cause a 22% tensile drop in the aggregate concrete you just tried to authorize. I know that within 36 months, the tunnel will suffer a catastrophic microfracture cascade." Preston froze. The specific terminology, the cadence of the voice, it was suddenly horrifyingly familiar. "But more importantly," Henry continued, stepping right up to Preston, his gray eyes piercing through the older man's panicked facade, "I know exactly how you falsified the load-bearing reports, because it's the exact same method you and Michael used to frame me for the Skyline Bridge collapse 5 years ago." A collective gasp echoed through the boardroom. "My name is Henry Pendleton," Henry announced, the words finally freeing a weight he had carried for half a decade. "And as of 10 minutes ago, copies of these manifests, along with the original unredacted Skyline blueprints, have been securely transmitted to the Department of Justice, the SEC, and the New York Times." Preston staggered back, his knees hitting his leather chair. The blood drained from his face, leaving him looking like a hollow, terrified old man. There was no maneuvering out of this. There were no scapegoats left to burn. "You're fired, Preston," Sylvia said, her voice echoing with absolute, unquestionable finality. "The authorities are waiting for you in the lobby." She turned to the stunned board members. "Sterling Ascendant will take a massive PR hit. Our stock will plummet tomorrow. But we will not build our future on the graves of the innocent. We are ripping up the Hudson contract and starting over, meeting adjourned. The truth, no matter how deeply buried under concrete and corporate greed, always finds the light." Sylvia Sterling chose to dismantle a fraction of her empire to rebuild a man's destroyed life, proving that real power isn't about the wealth you hoard, but the wrongs you are brave enough to right. Henry Pendleton returned to engineering, building bridges that would finally stand the test of time.